I'll start with a quick review for this book, A Thousand Brains. I think the book started very well, very interesting. It started even with Richard Dawkins' introduction, very good. I would say the first third of the book is very intriguing, interesting. It talks about the brain, but then he moves on to talk about the threats that are posed to humans and a little bit about AI. So I wasn't sure exactly. So the part about AI, I can see why it is related, even though I think it was too long. However, the part about the threats, I think it was totally unrelated. Therefore, this book would get a 3 out of 5. Without those, without at least without the second part, it would get a 4. It has an interesting view about AI, but I think he went way over or outside of what I thought at least the book would be about the brain. So let's see the notes. There is a constant conflict between the mammalian or old brain to the prefrontal cortex or the new brain. So that there's the constant battle, in a way, between the old brain and the new brain. Pain can be just a flag since it would be ignored by the new brain. So pain, you would ask the question why pain can just be a flag, a red flag. It was like a notice. Oh, there is a problem here. Why? Because it would just be ignored by the new brain. Therefore, the old brain that responsible for pain has to make it very prominent. The brain evolved in layers, one on top of the other, where the newest one is the neocortex. There's just one layer on top of the other. The new one is the neocortex. The neocortex is responsible for intelligence, vision, and general thinking. So all the new parts are the responsibility of the neocortex. The neocortex is not connected directly to muscles and has to go through the old brain to make a movement. So it doesn't have direct control over movement. It has to go through the old brain. According to one theory, the new cortex works in layer charts, where each layer builds some part of the whole picture. So he disputes that model, but that model says that every part of the brain is responsible for some part of the picture, and then everything is put together. He disputes that again. The neocortex covers 70% of the brain, so most of our brain is the neocortex. According to one theory, what determines the function of a particular area is what is connected to, not the tissue itself, as they're all the same. So that's a theory they come up with. So the function, basically all tissues is the same. It just depends where it's connected to, and it could be changed. The neocortex is controlling a lot of data and not always acting on it immediately. So you're just collecting data. It could take years before it acts on it. Learning and knowledge mostly take place in the connection between neurons rather than the neurons themselves, unlike what they used to think, where the learning happens with the connections, not in the neurons themselves. Interesting. Sequence memory is those things we do the same every time. Language is one of them. It could be the way we drive or language. That's called sequence memory. Predictions are made inside neurons and explain 90% of the brain's activity. Predictions travel to other neurons but don't activate it. So predictions are 90% of the brain's activity, and that does happen in the neurons themselves and not in the connections. There are some electrical signals sent to other neurons, but it does not activate it. We all have grid cells, almost like a map that tracks where we are and used as a reference point. So it's our grid cells. They're used as a reference point where everything is. When we move our fingers on an object while blindfolded, our brain goes through elimination since there could be few things that correspond to that object. So our brain goes through elimination process. Reference points are effective both for physical objects and for conceptual ideas. So he proposes the idea of reference points. That's how our brains store knowledge. Thinking could be moving through the grid cell space. That's what he says. Like, so what thinking could be. Some concepts are hard to grasp because they're not very tangible. Next one is, when we lack reference points, we are lost, just like we're lost in the woods. That's what happens when we don't have reference points. It's reference points all the way down, so he really likes the idea of reference frames and points. Our knowledge is distributed among many models and they complement one another, just like the knowledge about the city's infrastructure. So many models, many parts of the brain has the knowledge, but where it all fits together, it's distributed. So, for example, he brings a very good analogy of the city's infrastructure when many people know some parts of it and there is an overlap, obviously, and no one knows it all. It's all distributed. The brain grasped an object by process voting. The object that got the highest vote wins. That's how the brain is like a democracy. That's why we decide what do we feel if it's a coffee cup, what it is. The model that gets the highest vote wins. The brain is not much hierarchical, rather it's a competition between different models. So it's not like there is a CEO or something like that. It's different models and the highest one, whoever gets the highest vote wins. AI is using statistics, but it's not truly intelligent. That's the problem with AI. It's just using statistics for now. Unlike the brain that forms new synapses when new information gets in, AI cannot be changed after its deployment. So when it's already there, there is no new learning, even while the brain can always learn new stuff. AI needs reference points. That's what's missing. Reference frames. That's what's missing in AI. Intelligence is determined not by the ability to do certain tasks, rather by how information storage is being implemented and learned from. So that's what intelligence is. Not about how well we're doing certain things, is how we store that information. And can we learn from that information? According to the author, the sense of self is a product of the ability to think about the past and form memories. That's what he thinks. I think it's a little bit simplified view of things, but it's interesting nonetheless. That's how the sense of self is. Thinking about the past and forming memories. He thinks that we would be able to create consciousness in machines. Qualia is how we perceive or sense things, which could be different depending on the person. That's what qualia is. It's a product of consciousness, because everyone feels something else or perceives something else. We both see a keyboard, but it's not necessarily we perceive the same thing. According to the author, even if a machine is conscious, it's okay to turn it off since they won't have the old parts that are responsible for fear. There is, in philosophy, there's the debate of whether we can turn off a conscious machine. He thinks that there is no problem because a conscious machine would not have the old parts of the brain that have the problem with turning things off. The parts about fear and hope and all that, AI would not have it. According to one theory, awareness is a region in the brain. It's an interesting theory. Specific parts that is responsible for awareness. According to the author, the neocortex is responsible for intelligence, whereas the old brain is responsible for emotions, and therefore AI would only need the newer parts. So he claims that the older parts of the brain are not needed because the intelligence is primarily in the newer parts, so in the neo cortex. Silicon chips are about a million times faster than neurons. They can do much more than our neurons that are biological. One advantage of artificial intelligence is cloning, which relieve us from the need to learn everything as humans. So humans, we burn with nothing, with a blank slate, in a way. We do have some previous knowledge, the framework, I would say, but we can clone ourselves. A computer, we can gather as much information that they want, and we can just very easily clone that. AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, is unlikely since the world is constantly changing and information is scattered all around. So the author thinks that AGI is unlikely because there is so much information to learn and it's very scattered. So he argues against the possibility of AGI. Intelligence is the ability to learn a model of the world. That's again how the author, describe or define intelligence. In order for AGI to be malevolent, someone would have to program it with a lot of abilities, which is unlikely to happen. He does not think that AGI would be malevolent because someone would have to make it that way. And why would we do that? We live in a simulation, but not in a computer simulation. A simulation in our heads because we perceive the world in a very specific way, which does not reflect reality. Life is not Life is not about having the correct model of the world. It's about application and replication. We don't have to necessarily have the perfect model of the world. As long as we can replicate and applicate and the right application of information, that's all we need. In a fight, the old brain often wins. That's why the new brain develops technology to gain advantage, such as birth control. So it's very hard for the new brain to win over in a battle with the old brain. What it does, it creates technology to bypass the old brain, such as birth control is a good example, because the old brain, in a way, thinks that we're still having sex and reproduce, but nothing happens. Uploading ourselves could be a lost cause since we would have to include everything, which includes biological components, since otherwise it would not be the same. So the problem with uploading ourselves to the cloud is that we would have to do everything, including biological parts, including the whole part of the brain, because otherwise it would not be the same. But the problem is that it's very hard to replicate all those billions of connections in the brains. Uploading ourselves to a computer is actually splitting yourself into two, since they would grow apart afterwards. So basically, uploading ourselves is splitting ourselves. It's an interesting idea because what happens is they would grow apart. They would have different experiences afterwards. Just like with extraterrestrial life, entrepreneurs are much better sharing their idea and hope that someone would care about it over keeping it to themselves. So the same thing that happens with entrepreneurs. The ones who share their information, who share their idea, are more likely to survive rather than those who keep it to themselves because they think someone would take it away. Usually, you would just hope that someone cared enough about your idea and would help you develop the idea. He thinks it's the same about extraterrestrial life. We tend to think that we have it so well, and aliens would want to kill us. He thinks that it's unlikely. We might as well share the information. And the next one. Side note, the author deviates from brains to sci-fi and climate change. So that's the parts that I said I spoke about in the review part a little bit, but it comes again. There's a lot about, he deviates a lot. I would say maybe only a third is about brains, and then he moves to climate change, sci-fi, and all of other unrelated subjects that I think were not as good. And therefore, this book is a 3 out of 5. Thank you very much.